House Media.
A quick warning before we begin. This episode will contain the names of people and places that are entirely fictional, which I'm sure to mispronounce often. I hope you'll find it in your heart to forgive me. Enjoy the show.
Between the years when the oceans drank Atlantis and the rise of the sons of Arius, there was an age undreamed of, when shining kingdoms lay spread across the world. Hither came Conan, the Cimmerian, sword in hand. It is I, his chronicler, who knows well his saga. Now let me tell you of the days of high adventure.
And welcome to Hither Came Conan, the podcast that oftentimes has trouble just getting a grip on reality, much less a good grip on the hilt of a sword. I'm your host, my name is Steeven, and today we're going to do something just a bit different.
That's why I'm different.
I know that as of last episode, I said that we would be talking about Conan the Barbarian, issue number 25, The Mirrors of Karamakad, published by Marvel Comics in January of 1973, but that episode isn't quite ready yet. So rather than have another week with no episodes at all, I put this together to, one, update you on what I'm currently doing in regard to the format of how the episodes are now being sorted across the various podcasting apps, and then to play you an episode I recorded back in 2019 for another podcast in which I talked about the first Conan trade from Dark Horse. But first, a quick update on the show. Now, depending on where you listen or what app you use, you may have noticed that Hither Came Conan is now separated into seasons. I did this because I have this whole neurodivergent thing going on up in my brain. And I wanted to be able to try and group the episodes together based on what they were about. Now, if you listen to the show using an app that doesn't sort episodes into seasons, like Overcast, for example, or if you are listening using YouTube, then nothing really changes for you. Nothing at all. And hey, real quick, speaking of YouTube, if you do listen to the show using YouTube, if you are a regular YouTube listener, I am going to give you this opportunity over the next, I'll give you 3 weeks from when this episode lands to let me know, yes, I listen to the show on YouTube, because I don't know if I've talked about this before, but based on the analytics that I can see on YouTube, I see that each episode is being listened to a number of times. However, the average view time is what they call it there on the YouTube is about 3 minutes, which tells me that, yeah, this episode or, a particular episode may show 250 views, but most of those are people who listen to the first 3 minutes and then move on. And I'm just starting to feel like, what's the point? Maybe I should use the YouTube channel to do something a little different. So if you don't want me to do that, if you listen to full episodes, each and every time I put one up there on the YouTube, this is your chance to let me know. You can comment there on YouTube, or you can send me an email, feedback@hithercameconan.com. But back to the subject at hand. If you listen to the show using apps like Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or Pocket Casts, then you've probably noticed that the episodes are now being sorted into seasons. But just to run it down very quickly, season 1 consists of the first 3 episodes. That would be The Frost Giant's Daughter, The Phoenix on the Sword, and The Scarlet Citadel, as well as the 2 episodes that don't really fall in line with any of the other seasons. And those are the episode in which I'm talking about the cartoon, Conan the Adventurer, episode number 1, and then the bonus episode, The Frost Giant's Daughter Birthday Remix, that I put out just a little bit back. Season 2 is 12 episodes. This is the first 12 issues of the Marvel Conan the Barbarian run from the 70s. Season 3 is 4 episodes. This is the first 4 issues of the new Titan Conan the Barbarian run, which those 4 episodes make up the first arc, Bound in Black Stone. Season 4 is 12 episodes. It's issues 13 through 24 of the Marvel Conan the Barbarian run from the 70s. Season 5 is 4 episodes. It's issues 5 through 8 of the new Titan Conan the Barbarian run, which make up the second arc, Marked for Death. And then season 6 is 8 episodes. This is the first 7 issues of the Dark Horse Conan run from 2004, along with this episode here. And then with the next episode, Conan the Barbarian number 25 for Marvel 1973, that will be the start of season 7, which, if all goes to plan, should contain issues or 12 episodes talking about issues 25 through 36. And then we'll move on to season 8, which will be 4 episodes talking about issues 19 through 12 of the new Titan Conan the Barbarian run, which make up the third arc, The Age Unconquered, which is still currently being published. And to be honest with you folks, I struggled with the idea of waiting until all 4 issues of The Age Unconquered released before releasing the episodes, mainly due to the fact that those Titan episodes would no longer be timely. But then I heard something on an episode of the podcast, Very Special Episodes, in which one of the hosts mentioned that many of their episodes would not be considered timely. And in response to that, he said, and I am paraphrasing, "It's better to be interesting than timely." And like him, I'd like to think that my episodes are interesting. Anyway, that's what's going on with the show currently. But as I said earlier, I don't have the Conan the Barbarian number 25 episode quite ready just yet. And so rather than go another week in silence, I wanted to close out season 6 here with an episode I did over 5 years ago. See, when I first came back to podcasting in 2018, I started with a show called the Steeven or Else podcast. It ran for 43 episodes. You can't find it anywhere online anymore. And in January of 2019, I released episode 21, in which I talked about Conan, Volume 1, The Frost Giant's Daughter, and other stories from Dark Horse Comics. It was published in March of 2005, and of course collects the very same 7 issues that I've already talked about here in season 6. But I thought it might be fun to hear what I thought about this story 5 years ago, before I'd even read any of the original Robert E. Howard stories. Now, something to keep in mind, in 2019, I didn't yet have a proper setup for recording, but instead I used my phone and the mic that is built into it. And I would record in my car in the parking lot at work, early in the morning, like an hour or more before my shift would start. I mention it because you are going to notice an obvious difference in quality of the audio, though I have done all that I could do to make it sound as good as I can get it to sound. I also mention it because I didn't have a lot of notes with me in the car. It was just me and my phone and maybe a sheet of paper giving me the date or dates of whatever I'm talking about, you know, when it released, and then the creative team. That's about it. So most of what you're about to hear is just right off the top of my head. So yeah, keep all of that in mind as we jump into me over 5 years ago talking about Conan, Volume 1, The Frost Giant's Daughter, and other stories from Dark Horse Comics. It should be kind of fun. I mean, I haven't actually listened to what you're about to hear since it first released on Monday, January the 14th, 2019. I'm going to listen to it now before I come back after I add this episode. I'll come in after and I'll give you my closing thoughts. But yeah, I haven't listened to it yet. So enjoy.
Into the boat.
I'm your host, Steeven, and this week I'm talking Conan. And that's Conan, not Conan, right? Is that up for debate? Some people call him Conan. Some people call him Conan. When I think of Conan, I'm thinking of Conan O'Brien. So I'm going to try my best to call him Conan, though I know I sometimes slip into the Conan name. But that's what we're talking about this week, Conan, specifically the first Dark Horse trade from Kurt Busiek and Cary Nord. And so let's do that. Before we get into the book, however, let's do a little history of Conan. So according to the Great Repository for All Human Knowledge, otherwise known as Wikipedia, the character of Conan was created by Robert E. Howard in 1932 in a series of fantasy stories published in Weird Tales magazine. Now, I've never read any Conan stuff. I know that eventually, Robert Jordan, if you don't know who that is, he's the guy that wrote the Wheel of Time series, which will be coming to Amazon Prime at some point in TV show format. He is also known for writing Conan stories after, Robert E. Howard stopped. And I don't know, we're talking 20 years ago, maybe 20, 30 years ago when Robert Jordan did it. But I've never read any of the Conan books. That's not how I was introduced to Conan, was by the books. I know they're out there, and I've known that they're out there for a long time. And I actually have probably 3 or 4 old beat up Conan paper books around the house somewhere. I need to go look for them because I'd love to read them. And the only reason I never have is because, being the comic book guy that I am, I feel like I should read them in order, but I probably don't have to. Now, eventually the character did come to Marvel Comics in the 70s. It was written by Roy Thomas, and there were actually 2 different books that Marvel did. There was Conan the Barbarian, and that ran from 1970 to 1993 and had a total of 275 issues, all written by Roy Thomas. Then they also did The Savage Sword of Conan. That ran from 74 to 95 for a total of 235 issues. Roy Thomas wrote those as well. Those were black and white and were in magazine format, meaning they weren't comic book size, they were magazine size. And the reason they did that is, producing the book as a magazine, they didn't have to follow the Comics Code Authority. So they could do all the kind of stuff that Conan would be doing that they couldn't do in the actual comic book because of the Comics Code Authority. Now, Dark Horse eventually picked up the property in 2004. They had it until 2016. The book we're going to talk about is the first 7 or so issues of those Dark Horse books. But eventually, Conan has found its way back to Marvel. And the first issue of the new Conan books, written by Jason Aaron, came out this month. Now, for me, my history with Conan, my first introduction to Conan was around 1984. The movie Conan the Destroyer had come out, and I probably saw it. I didn't go see it in the theater. I probably saw it on HBO, or it could have been on like TNT or something. I just remember, I don't think Conan the Destroyer was rated R. I think it was rated PG-13, whereas Conan the Barbarian, which came out in 82 and had James Earl Jones in it as the bad guy, that was rated R. And it was a number of years before I saw it. Because, I was just a little guy back then. And in 82, I would have been about 10 years old. So yeah, probably 12 or 13 by the time I saw Conan the Destroyer. But that movie was amazing to my little 12, 13-year-old mind. I mean, we have Conan, who's this muscly dude. He's got this little partner with him, and they're thieves. They are hired by this woman to go take this princess to get this horn, like a magical horn. And with them on their adventure is Grace Jones and Wilt Chamberlain. So they go on this quest. They find the horn. They bring the horn back, find out that the horn is there to bring the avatar of this god to life. And then they're going to sacrifice the princess. And so they put the horn in this statue, which turns into a monster. And of course, Conan gets to fight it, and he rips the horn off, and there's lots of blood. It's really cool. That was my first real experience with Conan. Like I said, I'm sure I'd seen the comics. Now and again, I may have even read 1 or 2. I have no real memory of reading any Conan comics, to tell you the truth. I can tell you that Barry Windsor Smith was the artist on a number of them, the Marvel comics. But beyond that, no real idea. Now, again, eventually I did see Conan the Barbarian, which I did not like as much as Conan the Destroyer. And then, of course, there was a Conan reboot a few years back, and I want to say Jason Momoa played Conan. I don't remember anything about that movie. I remember liking it, but beyond that, I don't remember much about it. But that's my history with Conan. Eventually, when the Dark Horse books started coming out, I think I had read one or two of them, but when I read this trade recently, it was apparent to me relatively quick that I didn't get that far. I think I just read two. I didn't really get that far into it. Okay, so Conan, the Frost Giant's Daughter and Other Stories. This was a trade paperback published by Dark Horse Comics in 2005. It was written by Kurt Busiek. The art was by Cary Nord and Thomas Yeats. Color art by Dave Stewart. And the letters were by Richard Starkings and Comic Craft. This collected issues 0 through 6 and 14 pages from issue number 7. Now, before we get into the story itself, I want to just mention the book was freaking beautiful. It is a gorgeous looking book. The art, I mean, first of all, Dave Stewart is just an incredible colorist. He knows how to color a freaking book. And that's an art form unto itself that I'm never going to understand. He was actually the one. Okay, so from what I understand, I remember at the time reading about the book and reading about the fact that when the art was done, they basically colored Cary Nord's pencils. There was no real inking done. So typically in a comic book, you do pencils, you go over it with inks, and then you color it. But Dave Stewart, apparently, I just recently read that Dave Stewart was the one. He was the guy that looking at Cary Nord's pencils, he said, I want to just color it. I don't want, let's not even do inks. Let's just color the pencils. And I have seen that done with other books and have not enjoyed it at all. I like a nice black line. I like some inks on a book. I think for certain books, you need that crisp black line separating the colors, but it freaking worked in this book. I mean, like I said, it is gorgeous. If you have not even just looked at any of these issues, you really need to, because it is a beautiful looking book. The story is also great. So that's, that's already, you've got a great looking book and you've got a great story. So that's an A+ book in my park. I don't know what parks have to do with it. I don't know if I was trying to go for a sports reference there, but I did. And I failed. Anyway, I think the only nitpick I would have with the book, and I remember when I read the first issue or two back then, the narration. There are narration boxes that go along with it, narration boxes. And the typeset, the font used in those narration boxes look like typewriter letters, done from a typewriter. And I was actually turned off at first with that, because it's, in my mind, it's like, okay, we're reading a book about, it's a sword and sorcery book. It's set in the past, a fictional past. There were no typewriters back then. Why are these text boxes? Why does it look like I'm reading a yellowed page that has been typed? And eventually it kind of hit me. Well, that's because, I can only assume that the idea was that they were wanting us to, connect that with Robert E. Howard's books. Like we were reading his original drafts and then seeing it all come to life on the page. That's the only possible outcome I could come up with in regard to that choice of font. And once that hit me, I had no problem with it after that. So the book opens up actually in the future. It's still in the past, but it's Conan's future. And I'm not gonna use a lot of the names from the books because honestly, I'm not 100% how to pronounce them, and I've forgotten most of them as it is. But you've got this prince whose father apparently runs the biggest empire in the world. They're the guys that now run things in the world. And I don't know if he's out collecting taxes or if they're just exploring some of the outlying areas of their realm. But at some point, they stumble across something that is, I think it's supposed to be a tomb. And in investigating, they find this giant treasure room. But the one thing that really seems to pique the interest of this prince is this toppled statue, and it's of Conan. And I know from, when my periphery of the world of Conan, and I believe they mention it, I think it's at the end of both movies, that eventually Conan does become a king of some kingdom. And so this is a statue of Conan the king, and there's some writing on the base of the statue. And the prince is just really interested in this Conan guy, and he wants to know more about him. So this opening is from the 0 issue, and it's really kind of there to kind of set up, what we're looking at. We are reading what these scholars and scribes and whatever that work for the prince, what they have gathered up about the stories of Conan. So I guess maybe that, I don't know. So that's what kind of leads into the main ongoing series, starting with issue 1. So with issue 1, when we get into the actual series, you've got Conan. He's a young man at this point. He may be in his early 20s, and he's come out of Cimmeria, and he stumbles across this village and these warriors that have attacked this village that's full of women and old men. And the race of people in the village, I think they were called Aesir, Aesir, and they Conan refers to them a few times as men of Asgard, even though the only god that I hear them that I remember them mentioning is Ymir, Ymir. I don't know, man. I don't know if that's a real Asgardian god. I've never run into the dude watching any of the Thor movies, I'll tell you that. This other group of I don't remember what they were called. They have a blood feud. The Aesir and this other group, this other race of people, and the bad guys, we'll just call them bad guys, have attacked this village because their men are out hunting. And so Conan comes across this. He helps to defend the village. He kills a lot of these guys because that's what he does. That's what Conan does. And then the Aesir warriors come back, and they also are bitter enemies of Cimmeria. Apparently, nobody likes Cimmeria. Nobody likes them at all. The Cimmerians are not people that the rest of the world seem to like. But because Conan stepped in and helped these people, they become friends. And so Conan, with all the other warriors, set out to go track down these warriors that attacked the village. And during this adventure, there's a battle in the snow. Everybody is killed except for Conan. He goes stumbling away, where he encounters a very pale-skinned woman who's practically nude, dancing around in the snow. She draws him away, where he is then attacked by a pair of frost giants. He kills them both. And then I think if I remember, he passes out. But eventually the Aesir warriors from the village, they find him, and he tries to tell them what happened, but there's no record. The dead giants are gone. The woman's gone. Was it true or not? But we do learn at some point that Conan, the reason he's left Cimmeria is his grandfather. Cimmerians apparently are not known for leaving their lands. They like to stick where they're at. But Conan's grandfather also left at one point, and he came back, and he would tell stories to Conan about the other people out there in the world. And the one that really stuck to Conan was a place called Hyperborean. And there were just these tales that his grandfather would tell of the immortal people that lived in Hyperborean, and how it was an idyllic place, even though they were in the north, in the mountains, where it's cold and bitter all the time. In Hyperborean, it was warm and sunny. It just was just this wonderful place. And these immortal people, when they were tired of life, they would leap from the cliffs, and these magic winds would take them to their gods. And Conan really wanted to go see this place. So he leaves Cimmeria to go see Hyperborean, and that's when he runs into the village being attacked, and he becomes a part of this group of warriors. But there's one particular guy, Sjarl or something like that. Man, I'm sorry I didn't note down any of these names because they were all freaking weird. But when Conan first encounters this village, what he actually encounters is a woman and her baby, and this warrior is about to kill them. And Conan steps in and just slices the dude's head, just cleaves it from his body. Just such a great panel. There's a couple of panels in the book where Conan just slices, just chops a guy's head off with his sword. And just the way it's drawn, it's not like super gory and bloody. It's just really awesome. Cary Nord is just a great artist. But anyway, the woman that he saves Of course, she kind of, hey, you're a big, strapping, muscly man who saved my life. You now have my eye. But there's a guy in the village, one of the warriors, who kind of likes her. And so now he's all upset. Not only has the Cimmerian come and made friends with all these dudes, he's also might be making some time with his lady. So when they go out to track down the warriors that attack their village, this Sijarl, he and another guy are plotting against Conan. And so they're out there and they're tracking down more of these warriors. And there's the big final battle between Conan and his guys and the other warriors, when suddenly these giants, and by giants, they're probably like 10, 12 feet high, but they're these big, pale looking dudes. And at first I thought they were frost giants. They all come in and they start attacking. And Conan and his boys, they can't fight them off. And so they make a deal with the other guys. Let's team up together, give us our weapons back, and we'll fight alongside you, because this is the bigger threat. So they let them go. They get their weapons back. In the meantime, Sijarl, he and his buddy, they leave, and they were trying to lure Conan away at one point. They're saying, after the battle, we need to go. We'll go with you to Hyperborea. And you find out that Sijarl has made a deal with some other group to bring Conan to them so they can capture him as a slave.
Hither Came Conan will return after these messages. And now back to Hither Came Conan.
Well, when these giants rush in, Sijarl's up there on this rock with his buddy watching this happen, and he's like, oh no, they're early. They decided not to wait. So whoever these guys are, these are the guys that they made a deal with. Well, in the meantime, Conan's down there and he's with the leader of the other group. And the leader says, look, I have an idea of how to get us out of this. If we can just take 2 or 3 people and get them around to the other side of this battle and put them on high ground, they can attack from that side. And that will help us defeat these guys. And Conan's like, I'm on it. And he takes off and he sees Sijarl and his buddy up on this rock. And he's like, that's it. That's where we got to be. There's 2 guys, me, that's 3. Let's do this. He climbs up on the rock and he's telling Sijarl the plan. And Sijarl's like, you know what? Nope. And kicks Conan away. And he ends up getting beat up, right? Falls into unconsciousness and everything goes black. So when Conan wakes up, we learn that he's in Hyperborea. These large, giant men are basically creatures made through sorcery by the Hyperboreans. And that's who Sijarl had to deal with. And the Hyperboreans are immortals. And they do live an idyllic life. But they do that through the use of magic. And they do that through the use of slaves. And they send these giant warriors out to capture people and bring them back to be their slaves, and to also add men to their army. So these giant warriors aren't their only soldiers. They have their own army. And Conan and the guys that he are with, they're put into this army. But they do it with the use of this chemical potion that clouds their minds. And one of the slave women comes to Conan at one point, and because he has been able to 3 times since he had been there, and he'd been there for a while now, I don't know, a few weeks or a month, 3 times during that time frame, he has such strength of will and strength of mind. He was able to fight through this potion or the smoke or however they use it to cloud their mind and come back to himself. So she sees this. She goes to him. She wants to escape, and she gives him these leaves and says, if you chew on these leaves, if you do like 3 leaves a day, 3 times a day or whatever, then the potion stuff won't work on you anymore. And it was actually very reminiscent. I have to assume that I don't know which came first, because I know that during this run, stuff like the Frost Giant's Daughter and other stories that are interwoven with the main story are actually adapted by Robert E. Howard's short stories. But this whole part here where Conan is captured, He is put under mind control. He's being used at first for sport as a gladiator and then being trained as a warrior until a slave woman gives him these leaves that will help wake up his mind. That totally happened in like the first animated G.I. Joe cartoon movie where Duke is captured by Cobra and he has this headband put on him to turn him into a slave. And they have all these other slaves that have these headbands and they're controlled through this electronic mind control. And he's forced to fight in a gladiator arena with another slave gladiator until a slave woman who wants to be free gives him this little gold strip of metal that he can slide it into the headband. So between his skin and the headband, that will stop the mind control. So I have to assume that this part in the Conan story was adapted from one of Robert E. Howard's short stories. And then the people who wrote the G.I. Joe movie in the 80s just took it from that. Or it's just a big coincidence because that crap happens all the time. So anyway, there's this whole plan. He asks her for more of the leaf because he wants to free all these other dudes with him because he gave them their word that he would be part of their band, that he would fight for them. He would have their back. They would have his back. So he will agree to help her escape. But if they're going, they're all going. Now, what you learn at this point, though, is that these Hyperborean people, these immortals, when one of them decides that they are tired of life, they've lived for centuries. They realize that life, really is boring and they're ready to just pack it all in. Then they go to this bridge that leads to nowhere that just ends and they leap off into this chasm below. But every one of their slaves, all their warriors, everybody that is in their quote unquote house, they also leap to their deaths. So there's like 20 or 30 people that leap into this chasm. And this slave girl knows that eventually the Hyperborean lord that she is, whose house she is in, is eventually going to want to do this. She doesn't want to die. So they come up with this plan and everything is going just fine until the lord that she is, whose house she is in, decides he's ready to end his life. So they have to escalate their plan. And Conan finds out, his warriors, they're all starting to wake up and then they all start fighting. They start fighting their way out. Conan is supposed to meet her at the end of the staircase. She's not there. He realizes that she had given him all the leaves that she used herself. And so she was back under the mind control. And in the end, he can't save any of them. They all leap to their death. He's the only one that survives. And it's only because he falls off of a wall into an alleyway and is struck unconscious. Nobody knows he's there. He's fighting like two guys. One of them he kills and he falls off of the wall. The other guy he kills and the guy falls on him and they both fall over the wall. And the three of them are laying there in this alleyway. Nobody else knows that they're there. Conan's not dead. He wakes up and realizes that this Hyperborean lord and all of his people, which include all the warriors, the Acer warriors that he was in a band with, not a rock and roll band, they all jump to their death. So he climbs down this cliff face down into this chasm, finds them all down there. There are these giant bugs that are eating them. He fights them off, and the main dude, the lord of the village, the Acer village, I think his name was Nord. He was still alive. He was just barely clinging to life. And he begs Conan to build them a pyre because their people believe that the only way they can get into, they never call it Valhalla. I think they call it the eternal land. I don't remember, but the only way that they can get there is through fire. So when they're dead, they're put on a pyre, and then the smoke rising into the sky is their souls being delivered to heaven, basically. And so Conan does that, and then Conan leaves, and now all he wants to do is find Sajarl and his buddy and end their life for everything that happened. And he tracks them to a village in Numidia or somewhere like that. Again, I can't remember a lot of these names. Finds them in this village, and man, he kills them both quickly, but
very brutally and violently. It's not shown, the book itself is not graphic, really. There's blood in it, but it's not over the top graphic. And, but like one of the dudes, he's standing over him with his sword and he's going to stab him. And the guy's yelling, no, no. And he just stabs him right in the mouth and, right through the back of the head, through his mouth. And, that's how the book, now he's done what he set out to do. He left Cimmeria to go to Hyperborea. He ends up in Hyperborea, realizes it's not obviously what he was told it was. The two men that betrayed him and his friends to get him there, he tracks them down, exacts his revenge, and now he's done. But he doesn't want to go back to Cimmeria. He's going to stay out and he's going to travel. And I think that must be because it said it collected books 0 through 6 and then like the 14 pages from book 7. So I'm assuming the rest of issue 7 is him setting out to start his next adventure. And I'm hoping that trade 2 has the rest of that issue. I would assume it would have to. So, but yeah. So that was Frost Giant's Daughter and Other Stories. A+. I don't really do grades for books, but it was a heck of a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun. It was beautiful. It was a great story. It was a real page turner. And I'm definitely going to keep reading the rest of these Dark Horse books.
Well, there you have it. And yeah, I actually said that it was a real page turner. I wasn't much of a podcaster back then. I mean, I was okay, but I was still podcasting under this idea that everything you record stays in the episode, editing nothing out, even the long moments of silence. And yeah, you didn't hear much of that because I took it all out. So yeah, you're welcome. But I thought it was interesting to hear because I really knew nothing about Conan back then. Not much, anyway. And at some point, I think I even mentioned not reading any of the Marvel comics, or at least I think I said I don't remember reading any, which at this point, I know isn't true because I have clear memories of reading some Conan in the 80s after John Buscema came on board. I mean, I've mentioned many times on this show that for me, when I think of Conan in the comics, it's the John Buscema Conan that comes to mind. But I don't know. I don't know what was going through my head back in January of 2019. And I mean, I've always had problems with my memory, meaning that there are bits of my past that will just drop out of my head for years at a time. And then suddenly it all just comes flooding back. And I have to assume that for those Conan comics from the 80s, that must have fallen out of my head back then. Of course, I wasn't an avid Conan reader. And frankly, I think most of my Conan comics exposure back in the 80s probably came from issues that my older brother bought and were most likely few and far between. But I don't know. To forget entirely that I did read some back then, well, that kind of freaks me out a bit, if I'm honest. It was also interesting to discover some of the bits from the book that I hadn't picked up on at the time. For example, I mentioned that Conan in the first issue of the Dark Horse run is in his early 20s, when, of course, we know from the very first panel of issue 1 that Conan was actually 16 years old. But again, I was podcasting without any notes at the time, so I'm sure I just forgot about that bit when I was recording. I mean, I couldn't even remember the name of the Vanir, that they were called Vanir or Vannerman because, yeah, I was hopeless. Oh, and I forgot all about the comparison to the first G.I. Joe animated miniseries from 1983, the mass device, and how back when I recorded this, I just assumed that the bit with Conan and Hyperborea must have been adapted from a Robert E. Howard tale, and that then G.I. Joe came along and used that same premise for Duke's capture by Cobra. But no, the G.I. Joe thing came first, which is really quite interesting. And then, of course, there was this bit. So anyway, there's this whole plan. He asks her for more of the leaf because he wants to free all these other dudes with him because he
he gave them their word that he would be part of their band.
He gave them their word that he would be part of their band. He gave them their word. Their word. He gave them their word. Unfortunately, I still do stuff like that today. I just have the good sense these days to go back and re-record such crass mistakes. But yeah, I had fun listening back to this and yet was super embarrassed at the same time. How about you? Feedback at hithercameconan.com. Anyway, this is the point in the show where I was actually going to wrap things up. But as I was putting this episode together, I recalled that there was one other time in the past, July of 2019, that I podcasted about Conan. I had rebooted the Steven or Else podcast into just Steven or Else, and I had a segment of the show in which I talked about something new that I had learned. And in the very first episode, released Monday, July 22nd, 2019, that new thing I learned was about Conan. Oh, and full disclosure, during this bit, I mention a website with a series of Conan articles that were published online under the umbrella title Hither Came Conan. And I just want to put it out there that for all of 2019, up to this point, once I'd podcasted about Conan Volume 1, The Frost Giant's Daughter, and other stories, I'd had this idea to start a Conan podcast, something I knew at the time I wasn't going to do. I didn't have time for it, but I told myself that if I was going to do it, I would call it Hither Came Conan. And then 5 months later, I stumble across these articles that, again, were published online under the umbrella title Hither Came Conan. And I was like, dang. But I didn't care because, as I said, I knew at the time that I would not be doing a Conan podcast. Fast forward to 4 years later, and I start this show, and I wanted to call it Hither Came Conan. But yeah, I thought about that website, and I thought about those articles. And in the end, I just figured, well, I'm going to use the name anyway because they weren't using it for a podcast. So there you go. The truth is finally out there. Anyway, here's the audio from July 2019 in which I talk about something I learned regarding Conan. Enjoy.
I need you.
I learn something new every day. For example, I had no idea that the first Conan story, written by Robert E. Howard, featured Conan as a king. No idea at all. Not until recently. See, I've always been a fair weather Conan fan. My first exposure to the character was the 1984 Arnold Schwarzenegger film, Conan the Destroyer. This was the second of the two Conan movies. The first, Conan the Barbarian, came out in 1982, and it was rated R. And since I was 10 at the time, I was not able to see it. But of course, Conan the Destroyer was rated PG, and it played all the time on TBS back then. And of course, there were the Marvel comics as well. I didn't read many of the comics, not back then. They'd been publishing the comics since 1970. And as they were coming out, right there at the beginning in 1970, I wasn't even born. But by the time I was watching Conan the Destroyer, I wasn't old enough to go out and pick up my own books. But I'd see him now and again, and I had always been rather intrigued by them. But up until recently, that was my history with Conan. Sure, in 2003, when Dark Horse picked up the property and started making comics, I gave him a try. And then, of course, there was also the Jason Momoa reboot in 2011, the movie, which I watched and I do remember enjoying. I should probably go back and give it a try. But in all that time, I had never read any of the original Robert E. Howard stories. The point I'm trying to make is that what little I had known about Conan from what I'd watched and read was that at some point he would become king. That's made pretty clear in the movies. There was even a King Conan comic from Marvel sometime back in the 80s. But here's the thing. The movies and the comics I read all featured Conan before he became a king. I knew that at some point he would come to rule. I had just always assumed, apart from the King Conan comic, that the main crux of the Conan mythology was all about the road to becoming king. But not that long ago, I decided I wanted to know more about the character, and I figured it might be best to start at the beginning. But being the low-rent fanboy that I am, I started with the library. They, unfortunately, had nothing. No paperbacks, no hardbacks, and no ebooks. So I stepped up to the next level and I checked out Amazon. I found a few collections that contained all of Robert E. Howard's Conan work, but even the ebook was way outside my price range. But then one day, the good folks at Amazon sent me an email. And by good folks, I do, of course, mean the robots. So basically, based on my recent Conan searches, they wanted to point me in the direction of an ebook called Conan the Barbarian Collected Adventures. And it was just 99 cents. It's still there for that price. At least it is now as I'm recording this. I don't know if it still will be by the time you hear this. Anyway, I couldn't turn that down. I bought it and I started reading immediately. It opened with a story called The Tower of the Elephant, in which Conan is a thief and he's breaking into this tower to steal a gem. It goes from there to Rogues in the House, which has been my favorite story so far. After that was Shadows in the Moonlight. And that's about as far as I got until I come across this website for Blackgate Magazine. They had recently started a series of articles on the website called Hither Came Conan, where different writers talked about each of Robert E. Howard's Conan stories. Looking through what they had at the time, my first thought was how stupid it was that they weren't doing the stories in order, or at least what I thought was the order in which they were published. I mean, their first article was for a story called The Phoenix on the Sword. And I was like, what? No, the first story is The Tower of the Elephant. Why are you guys doing this? Why are you making this difficult for me? But then as I was reading through the article, I stumbled upon what I consider an amazing discovery. Robert E. Howard didn't write the Conan stories chronologically, and I don't recall where I read it or who said it, but I found something at one point as I was looking that compared the writing and the publication of these stories told out of order when looking at Conan's life, as if the old warrior himself were telling the stories around the campfire. Because when you're just hanging out with your bros and you're telling them stories about the amazing things that you did in your life, you don't always go in order. You just don't. And that's kind of the idea here. And so at that point, I decided I would just go ahead and read the rest of the stories in the order in which they were published. And so I had to look through the book to find The Phoenix on the Sword, which, as I said, was the first. And I was almost blown over. I was almost knocked straight onto my keister to discover that it was about Conan the King. The first ever Conan tale he wrote, and he was already a king. Well, stick a fork in me, I'm done. The more research I did, I found out that the story was originally called By This Axe I Rule, and it was actually a tale originally. It was a tale that he wrote featuring another one of his characters, Kull of Atlantis, but he couldn't get it sold. So he reworked it, and blammo, history was made. And then to leave you with just a little bit more information, Roy Thomas adapted Phoenix on the Sword for Conan the Barbarian Annual #2 for Marvel Comics in June of 1976. Dark Horse did a 4-part adaptation of the Phoenix on the Sword as part of the King Conan line. I have read neither one.
Everybody out!
Next time on Hither Came Conan, we will finally get to Conan the Barbarian #25, The Mirrors of Karamakad, published by Marvel Comics in January of 1973. For those of you who are subscribed to Steeven or Else Plus over on Apple Podcasts or the super secret Steeven Society through the Patreon, you're going to get the Conan the Barbarian #25 episode next week on Monday, May the 6th. For everyone else, you're going to have to wait a week, as I am trying to offer an early and ad-free episode experience there on Steeven or Else Plus and the super secret Steeven Society. And I'm starting with this next episode, and I would like my subscribers to get it a week early to make it worth the cheddar that they're putting in. Cheddar, by the way, I believe is a hip youngster term for money. I don't know. I've heard it here and there. Anyway, if you're interested in subscribing, head on over to hithercameconan.com to get started. Until then, folks, keep your swords close by, never stop treading them jeweled thrones, and most importantly, be nice to each other. Bye. I want to thank you for listening to this episode of Hither Came Conan. Questions and comments can be directed to feedback@hithercameconan.com or come join us on social media. Just look for @Conan Podcast on Twitter and Blue Sky and @Hither Came Conan on Instagram, Threads, and Facebook. If you enjoyed today's episode, please rate the show over at Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening. Donations to the show can be made at donate.hithercameconan.com or become a member of the super secret Steeven Society and get episodes early and ad-free. Join now using the link in the show notes or go to secretsociety.hithercameconan.com. Memberships start at just $1 a month.
Many wars and feuds did Conan fight. Honor and fear were heaped upon his name. In time, he became a king by his own hand. This story shall also be told.
Just don't think I can move through life knowing that a guy named Steeven did this to me.
How could you let this happen, Steeven?
Your podcast sucks.
Enough talk.